Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Natchez. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The autumn of 1849 cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Natchez, Mississippi. As October waned toward its conclusion, the air grew heavy with the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke from the hearths that had been rekindled against the growing chill. Natchez had already established itself as one of the wealthiest cities in the young nation, with its prosperity built upon the cotton trade and the forced labor of thousands of enslaved people. The stately mansions that lined the streets under canopies of ancient oak trees stood as monuments to wealth accumulated through human bondage, a fact that many of the city's elite preferred not to acknowledge in polite conversation. Among those grand homes stood Caldwell House, the residence of Gideon Caldwell, a man whose name carried weight throughout Adams County and beyond. Situated on a sprawling property at the northern edge of the city, the Georgian-style mansion boasted 12 rooms, elaborate gardens, and a view of the Mississippi River that visitors often declared the finest in the region. Gideon had inherited the property from his father, who had acquired the land in the early years following American acquisition of the territory in 1798. By all accounts, preserved in the town records and personal correspondence, Gideon Caldwell was a respected businessman whose shipping interests connected Natchez to New Orleans and ports beyond. At 43 years of age in 1849, he cut a striking figure, tall and lean with a full beard that had begun to silver at the temples. His reputation for shrewd business dealings was matched only by his peculiar interests in what many of his contemporaries dismissed as superstition. The Natchez Free Trader, in a society column from March of that year, made a bleak reference to Caldwell's scholarly pursuits into matters beyond the veil of common understanding, a polite way of acknowledging his fascination with the occult without directly criticizing a man of his standing. What few outside his immediate circle knew was that Gideon Caldwell had been deeply changed by the death of his wife Sarah 7 years earlier. According to journal entries discovered decades later during renovations to the property in 1968, her passing had awakened in him an obsessive interest in communication with the dead. His library grew to include rare volumes on spiritualism, ancient rituals, and folklore from various cultures. Some of these books, shipped at great expense from Europe, contained knowledge that many of his God-fearing neighbors would have considered blasphemous. It was in the summer of 1849 that Arabella Moreau arrived in Natchez. The daughter of a French merchant from New Orleans, she had come to stay with her aunt, Mrs. Eleanor Wilkes, following the death of her father. At 24 years of age, Arabella was considered remarkably beautiful, with dark hair and eyes that many described as almost unnaturally intense. Her arrival caused a stir in local society, not only for her beauty, but also for the air of mystery that seemed to surround her. Rumors circulated that her father's business had collapsed before his death, leaving her without the fortune many had assumed she would inherit. What drew Gideon Caldwell and Arabella Moreau together would later become the subject of much speculation among those who chronicled the events of that fateful autumn. They were first seen in conversation at a gathering at the home of Judge Thomas Winchester in early August. Witnesses noted the intensity of their discussion, which appeared to venture far beyond the usual pleasantries of such social occasions. Mrs. Winchester would later recall overhearing fragments of their conversation that touched upon matters of the spirit world and ancient practices preserved by those who maintained the old ways. Within weeks, Arabella had become a frequent visitor to Caldwell House. This raised eyebrows among the more conservative members of Natchez society, particularly when it became known that some of these visits occurred without the presence of Mrs. Wilkes as chaperone. However, Gideon's standing in the community prevented any direct censure, and most assumed that their connection was merely that of a bereaved widower finding comfort in intellectual conversation with a young woman whose education far exceeded what was common for her sex. The truth, as documented in Gideon's private journal and later pieced together by investigators, was far more disturbing. Arabella Moreau claimed to possess abilities that allowed her to communicate with the dead. Whether she truly believed this or was merely exploiting Gideon's grief and obsession remains a matter of debate. What is clear is that by September they had begun conducting seances in the third-floor room that Gideon had converted into what he called his chamber of study. These seances were not the parlor entertainment that had become fashionable in some circles. According to the detailed notes Gideon kept, they involved elaborate rituals drawing from practices that predated Christianity. Arabella directed these ceremonies, instructing Gideon to acquire specific items: black candles made with unusual ingredients, herbs that had to be gathered under specific phases of the moon, and artifacts said to enhance connection with the spirit world. Most disturbing among these was a small oval mirror in a silver frame, which Arabella claimed could serve as a gateway between worlds when properly activated. While Gideon and Arabella conducted their secret rituals, the household staff observed changes in their master's behavior. Isaiah Johnson, who had been Gideon's personal manservant for over a decade, later provided testimony that forms one of the few first-hand accounts from someone who witnessed the progression of events. Johnson, a free man of color whose literacy was uncommon for the time, kept a small diary in which he recorded his growing concerns. "Master Caldwell speaks less each day," Johnson wrote in early October, "and what sleep he finds seems troubled. Twice this week I have found him at dawn, fully dressed, standing at the window of his study, as if he has passed the night there. When questioned about his health, he speaks of breakthroughs and promises soon to be fulfilled. I fear Miss Moreau's influence draws him toward some dark purpose." As October advanced toward All Hallows' Eve, the frequency of Arabella's visits increased. The household staff reported hearing strange sounds from the third-floor chamber, chanting in a language none recognized, sudden silences followed by what one maid described as a woman's laughter that raised the hairs on my neck, and on at least one occasion what sounded like furniture being overturned, followed by Gideon's voice raised in either fear or anger. On October 28th, 2 days before their disappearance, Gideon sent most of the household staff away, giving them 3 days' leave with unusually generous pay. Only Isaiah Johnson was asked to remain, supposedly to attend to essential duties. This departure from normal household management raised no immediate alarm, as it was not entirely uncommon for staff to be given time off around holidays. Yet in retrospect, it seems clear that Gideon was preparing for something he did not wish to be witnessed. The events of October 30th, the day that would later be referred to as the Halloween mystery in newspaper accounts, can only be partially reconstructed. Isaiah Johnson's account, given to authorities in the days that followed, described Arabella's arrival shortly after midday. She carried with her a small trunk that required Gideon's assistance to transport to the third-floor chamber. Johnson was instructed not to disturb them under any circumstances and to retire early, regardless of what sounds he might hear from above. Johnson's sense of unease was such that he did not in fact retire as instructed. Instead, he remained in the small sitting room adjacent to the kitchen, from which he could observe the main staircase. In his statement, he reported that as darkness fell, the quality of light visible beneath the door of the third-floor chamber changed, taking on what he described as an unnatural bluish hue that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Around 9 o'clock, Johnson heard what he initially took to be thunder, though the night was clear. The sound, he realized, had come from within the house, specifically from the third floor. It was followed by what he described as a woman's scream that seemed to begin in terror but transformed into something like ecstasy. After this came silence so complete that Johnson found it more disturbing than the sounds that had preceded it. Against his better judgment and his employer's direct instructions, Johnson ascended the stairs. The door to the third-floor chamber stood ajar, emitting a faint glow, unlike any lamplight or candle flame he had ever seen. As he approached, he detected an odor that he compared to the metallic scent of blood, mingled with something burning that was not wood or coal, but perhaps herbs or hair. What Johnson witnessed upon reaching the doorway would haunt him for the remainder of his life. In his initial statement to authorities, he claimed only that the room was in disarray, with the furniture pushed against the walls and strange symbols drawn on the floor. He reported that neither Gideon nor Arabella was present, though all doors and windows remained secured from the inside. It was not until years later, when approached by a researcher from Jefferson College who was compiling an academic study on the incident, that Johnson provided a more complete account. According to this later testimony, given in 1863 when Johnson was living in Cincinnati, what he saw in the doorway was far more disturbing than mere emptiness. The symbols on the floor appeared to move, though they were clearly drawn in some dark substance that had dried, he stated. The mirror Miss Moreau had brought stood in the center of these markings, propped upright on some kind of stand. And in this mirror, though it faced away from any window, I could see stars, not as reflections, but as if the glass itself had become a window into the night sky. As I watched, frozen in terror, I saw two silhouettes pass across those stars, like shadows walking into the distance. One was unmistakably Mr. Caldwell's tall figure, the other Miss Moreau's more delicate form. They appeared to be walking hand in hand, growing smaller, as if receding down a long corridor, though the mirror itself was no more than a foot in height. Johnson's account continued with his description of what happened next. As I stood there, unable to move or call out, the images in the mirror began to fade. Just before they disappeared completely, both figures turned, as if looking back over their shoulders directly at me. Their faces... Here, the transcript notes that Johnson paused for nearly a full minute before continuing. Their faces were no longer human. What I saw instead were holes, as if their features had been replaced by openings into absolute darkness. Then the glass of the mirror cracked from edge to edge with a sound like ice breaking on the river, and I fled downstairs in terror. The official investigation that followed found no trace of either Gideon Caldwell or Arabella Moreau. The third-floor chamber showed evidence of some ritual having been performed, with candle wax, unfamiliar herbs, and symbols drawn on the floor, in what testing revealed to be a mixture of animal blood and other unidentifiable substances. The cracked mirror was recovered and held as evidence, though it displayed no unusual properties when examined by authorities. Various theories were proposed to explain the disappearance. The most widely accepted was that Caldwell and Moreau had staged an elaborate hoax to cover their elopement, perhaps to escape the scandal that would have accompanied a formal engagement given their age difference and the short time of their acquaintance. This theory was supported by the discovery that a significant sum had been withdrawn from Caldwell's accounts at the Natchez bank 2 weeks before the disappearance. Others suggested more sinister explanations, that Moreau had somehow murdered Caldwell for his wealth and escaped, or that Caldwell, whose mental state had reportedly deteriorated, had killed both Moreau and himself in some remote location yet to be discovered. The river was dragged, nearby woods searched, and inquiries sent to other cities, all without result. Isaiah Johnson's account of supernatural occurrences was largely dismissed as the product of fear, superstition, and perhaps loyalty to an employer he wished to protect from posthumous scandal. He left Natchez soon after giving his initial statement, his reputation tarnished by whispers that he might have been involved in whatever fate had befallen the missing pair. The investigation was officially closed in 1850, with the disappearance classified as unsolved, but presumed to be the result of deliberate flight rather than foul play. Caldwell House remained unoccupied for nearly 2 decades, passing through distant relatives who showed no interest in residing there. Eventually, it was sold to a cotton broker from Memphis who knew nothing of its history. What reignited interest in the case was a discovery made in 1869 during renovations to the old Winchester property, located less than a mile from Caldwell House. Workers demolishing a sealed storage room in the basement uncovered a small leather-bound book that proved to be Arabella Moreau's personal diary. Its final entries shed disturbing new light on the events of October 1849. According to these writings, Arabella had indeed possessed knowledge of rituals meant to open pathways between worlds, knowledge passed down through her maternal line from ancestors who had practiced what she called the old religion in rural France. Her father had sought to suppress these practices, burning many of her grandmother's books after her death. Arabella's coming to Natchez was no coincidence, but a deliberate choice after she learned of Gideon Caldwell's interests through correspondence with a spiritualist in New Orleans who was acquainted with both of them. What emerges from Arabella's writings is not a plan for elopement or deception, but preparation for what she called the crossing. She believed that on certain days of the year, particularly Samhain, the Celtic festival that preceded Halloween, the boundaries between worlds grew thin enough that properly prepared individuals could pass physically from one realm to another. Most disturbing were her descriptions of the price such a crossing demanded. "The gateway requires sacrifice," she wrote in her final entry, dated October 29th. "Not merely blood or breath, but essence. What passes through must leave something behind, and what awaits on the other side is not what we once were, but transformation. G. believes we will find Sarah waiting, but I have not told him the full truth, that what wears her appearance will no more be his wife than what wears our forms after tomorrow night will truly be us." The discovery of this diary prompted a brief revival of interest in the case, but with both principal figures 20 years missing and presumed dead and no new physical evidence, the mystery remained officially unsolved. The diary itself disappeared from the county records office in 1871, with conflicting reports suggesting it was either stolen or deliberately destroyed by a court clerk who found its contents blasphemous. For several decades, the Caldwell Moreau disappearance faded into local legend, occasionally revived in sensationalist newspaper articles around Halloween or in the whispered stories told to frighten children. But in 1912, the case took another unusual turn when a guest at what had by then become the Magnolia Hotel, formerly Caldwell House, reported a disturbing experience in what had once been the third-floor chamber of ritual. The guest, a Professor James Blackwood from Columbia University, who was conducting research on riverboat commerce, requested a change of room after his first night, claiming to have been awakened by the sensation of being watched. Upon opening his eyes, he reported seeing a tall male figure and a smaller female figure standing at the foot of his bed, both dressed in clothing typical of the mid-19th century. Most unsettling was his description of their faces, which he claimed appeared to be absent of features, as if someone had erased them, leaving only smooth skin where eyes, nose, and mouth should be. When he called out, the figures reportedly turned and walked directly through the solid wall. Similar sightings continued sporadically throughout the 20th century, with particular concentration around the Halloween season. In 1954, the property, by then converted into a bed and breakfast, was the subject of an investigation by a team from Duke University's parapsychology department. Their findings were inconclusive, though they documented unusual cold spots in the third-floor room and electromagnetic anomalies that defied explanation with the technology of the time. Perhaps the most compelling modern chapter in the mystery came in 1968, when renovations to the building uncovered a hidden space behind the wall of the notorious third-floor chamber. Within this space was found a small wooden box containing several items: a lock of dark hair bound with silk thread, a man's gold pocket watch stopped at 9:17, presumed to be PM based on Johnson's timeline, and a fragment of silver that analysis suggested had come from the frame of a mirror. Most significantly, the space also contained a sealed glass vial holding a single sheet of paper. When carefully removed and unfolded by archivists, it revealed a message written in what graphologists later confirmed was Gideon Caldwell's handwriting. The note was brief and cryptic. "We have passed through. What returns wears our faces, but is not us. The mirror shows the truth. Break it when they come." The date on the note was October 31st, 1849, one day after the disappearance. This discovery raised disturbing questions. If Caldwell and Moreau had indeed disappeared on the night of October 30th, as all evidence suggested, how could Caldwell have left a message dated the following day? More troubling still, how could it have been sealed within a wall space that showed no signs of having been opened since the house's construction, decades before the events in question? Some researchers proposed that the date was simply an error on Caldwell's part, perhaps written in anticipation of their planned crossing. Others suggested more elaborate hoaxes or mistaken dating by the archivists. But for those familiar with the complete history of the case, including Isaiah Johnson's full testimony and Arabella's recovered diary entries, a more disturbing possibility presented itself: that something had indeed returned through the mirror on Halloween night. Something wearing the appearances of Gideon and Arabella, but fundamentally changed in nature. This theory gained unexpected support in 1972, when an elderly woman named Margaret Wilkes came forward with a family story passed down through generations. According to her account, her great-great-grandmother, Eleanor Wilkes, Arabella's aunt, had received a visit late on the night of October 31st, 1849, from what appeared to be her niece. The visitor had Arabella's face and voice, but behaved strangely, speaking in disjointed phrases and seeming confused about basic facts of their relationship. Most tellingly, Eleanor reported afterward that when she embraced her niece, the young woman's body felt unnaturally cold, as if carved from stone rather than flesh. The visitor departed after less than an hour, promising to return but never doing so. Eleanor reportedly told her husband that whatever had visited them that night wore Arabella like a garment, but was not her. A similar account emerged regarding a man matching Gideon Caldwell's description, who appeared at the offices of his shipping company on the same night, speaking with the night watchman briefly before departing into the darkness. The watchman's statement, preserved in company records, noted that Mr. Caldwell had seemed distant and strange in his manner, and that his eyes reflected the lamplight in a way that no human eyes should. Neither Gideon nor Arabella was ever officially seen again after these encounters. No bodies were ever found, no evidence of their continued existence in other locations ever discovered. What became of them, whether they met with foul play, orchestrated their own disappearances, or, as the most unsettling theory suggests, somehow passed beyond the boundaries of our world, remains one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in Natchez history. The third floor of what was once Caldwell House has been renovated numerous times over the decades. The room where the fateful ritual took place has served as a guest bedroom, a storage space, and most recently, part of the building's mechanical systems. Yet despite these changes, reports persist of unusual phenomena: unexplained cold spots, electrical malfunctions, and the occasional sighting of two figures, one tall and bearded, one smaller and feminine, observed from the corner of one's eye, but never when looked at directly. Most disturbing are the accounts from sensitive individuals who report seeing these figures more clearly, always noting the same detail. Where faces should be, there is only darkness, as if looking through windows into an endless void. Local Halloween tours now include the building on their route, though guides are careful to present the story as legend rather than established fact. Few know the full details of the case or the disturbing implications of the evidence discovered long after the original investigation closed. Fewer still know of the small, silver-framed mirror that remains in the collection of the Adams County Historical Society, kept in storage rather than on display due to the persistent reports from staff members that reflections in its cracked surface sometimes show not the room around it, but a star-filled darkness through which two silhouettes occasionally can be seen walking, hand in hand, always receding into the distance. As Halloween approaches each year, security at the building is quietly increased. Staff are instructed not to respond to knocking on the third-floor door after dark, particularly on October 31st. This precaution is officially attributed to concerns about trespassers or vandals, but those familiar with the building's history understand the real fear, that whatever passed through the mirror in 1849 might someday find its way back, wearing faces both familiar and impossibly wrong. The Caldwell Moreau disappearance stands as a reminder of the mysteries that persist even in our most documented historical narratives, spaces where evidence ends and the inexplicable begins. Whether understood as a tale of elaborate deception, tragic violence, or something that defies conventional explanation, it continues to disturb those who encounter it, suggesting boundaries more permeable than we prefer to believe and possibilities more frightening than we care to acknowledge. And so the mystery remains, a disturbing footnote in Natchez history, revisited each October when the veil between worlds grows thin, and those who know the story find themselves glancing uneasily at mirrors, wondering what might be looking back. What the public records do not reveal, what is known only to a handful of historians and descendants of those originally involved, is that the story did not truly end in 1849. According to documents kept private by the Historical Society until 1965, there were at least 3 more confirmed sightings of Gideon and Arabella in the decade following their disappearance, each occurring on Halloween night, and each marked by the same disturbing detail. Their faces, while recognizable in basic structure, possessed eyes that witnesses described as wells of absolute darkness, or holes through which one might fall forever. The most thoroughly documented of these encounters occurred in 1855, when a young woman named Catherine Thornton, who had purchased an antique silver hand mirror at an estate sale, reported seeing 2 unfamiliar figures reflected in it on Halloween night. According to her written account, preserved in the personal papers of Reverend William Parsons of the First Presbyterian Church, the figures appeared to be standing in a landscape of absolute night pierced by unfamiliar stars. As she watched, transfixed, they turned toward her and began walking closer, growing larger in the mirror's surface as if approaching from a great distance. Their faces became clearer as they drew near, Thornton wrote, and I observed with mounting horror that while their features were those of a handsome man and beautiful woman, their eyes were not eyes at all, but rather openings into some unimaginable void. The terror that seized me then was unlike anything I have experienced before or since, not of fear of physical harm, but of something far worse, the dissolution of my very self. Thornton's account continues with her description of dropping the mirror in panic, causing it to shatter on the floor of her bedchamber. In the fragments, she claimed, the figures were no longer visible, but for weeks afterward she was haunted by dreams in which they called to her by name, inviting her to join them beyond the glass. The Thornton incident might be dismissed as the product of an overwrought imagination, were it not for a detail that connects it directly to the Caldwell-Moreau disappearance. Among the shards of the broken mirror was found a small piece of paper, somehow preserved within the mirrors. Backing, what fills the void is neither human nor divine. This discovery, made public only in 1977 after Catherine Thornton's great-granddaughter donated the family papers to the Adams County Historical Society, provides perhaps the most compelling evidence that whatever ritual Gideon and Arabella performed on that fateful Halloween night achieved some outcome beyond simple disappearance or death, an outcome that left them transformed in ways that defy conventional understanding. On it were written words in a delicate feminine hand, later identified as matching samples of Arabella Moreau's writing. The crossing leaves us hollow. Further evidence emerged in 1983 during the restoration of St. Mary Basilica in Natchez. Workers removing old plastering in the bell tower discovered a small recess containing a journal bound in faded leather. The journal proved to belong to Father Thomas Kearney, who had served as a parish priest in Natchez from 1848 to 1862. His entries for early November 1849 describe being called to Caldwell House days after the disappearance to bless the premises at the request of the authorities. What Father Kearney recorded of his experience there goes far beyond the official report he submitted. According to his private writings, when he entered the third-floor chamber where the ritual had taken place, he was overcome by a profound sense of wrongness, as if the very air had been corrupted by something that had passed through. More disturbing still was his description of what happened when he attempted to bless the mirror that had been left cracked in the center of the room. As I made the sign of the cross before it, I beheld not my own reflection, but a vista of infinite. Darkness sown with points of light, unlike any stars known to our heaven. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, I felt myself drawn toward this abyss, my soul pulled by some terrible gravity. Then, at the furthest reaches of that dark expanse, I perceived two figures walking, hand in hand. They turned, as if sensing my gaze, and though they were too distant for me to discern their features clearly, I knew with the certainty of divine revelation that what I beheld were not human beings as God intended, but vessels emptied of their original essence and filled with something other. The male figure raised a hand in greeting, or perhaps in warning, and in that moment the mirror's crack widened and it shattered completely, falling to pieces at my feet. Father Kearney goes on to describe how he gathered the fragments of the mirror and sealed them in a lead box, which he then buried in consecrated ground beneath the basilica's foundation, accompanied by prayers not only of blessing, but of binding, rituals reserved for objects believed to serve as gateways for malevolent forces. His final entry on the matter, dated November 10th, 1849, contains a warning. What Caldwell and the Moreau woman sought, they found, but not as they imagined it. The boundary they crossed permits traffic in both directions, and what resides on the other side hungers for our world. The mirror was a door left ajar. I pray it remains forever closed. These accounts, taken together with Isaiah Johnson's testimony and the physical evidence discovered over the decades, paint a picture far more disturbing than a simple case of disappearance or murder. They suggest that on Halloween night of 1849, Gideon Caldwell and Arabella Moreau achieved what occultists had long sought: physical passage into another realm. What they could not have anticipated was that this passage would fundamentally alter them, emptying them of what might be called their human essence and leaving behind vessels that could be filled by something else. This interpretation gains further credibility from a discovery made in 1992 when an archaeologist from Tulane University, Dr. Eleanor Weston, was granted permission to conduct ground-penetrating radar surveys of several historical properties in Natchez, including the former Caldwell estate. Beneath the foundations of what had once been a small outbuilding approximately 50 yards from the main house, she detected an anomaly that suggested a small chamber or large box buried some 6 feet below the surface. Excavation revealed a lead-lined chest measuring approximately 2 feet square, sealed with both iron bands and what analysis would later confirm was a mixture of beeswax, grave dirt and salt, materials traditionally used in various cultures for spiritual containment. Inside the chest was a collection of items that established a direct connection to the Caldwell-Moreau case. A silver pendant bearing Arabella's initials, a man's signet ring identified through family records as belonging to Gideon, and most significantly, a leather-bound volume containing detailed notes on the ritual they had planned to perform. These notes, written in Gideon's hand, but including frequent annotations by Arabella, outlined a ceremony drawn from multiple traditions, Celtic, Egyptian, and certain practices described as antediluvian, designed to open a pathway to what they called the realm beyond the veil. The ritual required specific astronomical alignments present only on certain dates, with Halloween night of 1849 identified as the optimal convergence in our lifetime. Most chilling were the warnings scattered throughout the text, apparently added by Arabella based on information from sources Gideon either did not possess or chose to ignore. These cautions emphasized that while passage between realms was possible, it came at the cost of essential transformation, and that those who crossed over would leave behind all that makes them human. Furthermore, she noted that the pathway, once opened, becomes a door that swings both ways, permitting those who dwell beyond to peer into our world, and, if the proper precautions are not taken, to pass through in some form. The final pages of the volume contained hastily written notes that suggest Arabella may have developed reservations about their plan as the appointed date approached. The last entry, dated October 29th, reads simply, "G will not be dissuaded. The mirror is prepared. If my fears prove justified, and what returns is not truly us, may those who find this record know to destroy any reflective surface through which the hollow ones appear." The chest and its contents were transferred to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History in Jackson, where they remain secured in climate-controlled storage, available only to researchers with specific clearance. The official position of the department is that these materials constitute important historical artifacts relating to folk beliefs and superstitions of the antebellum period, with no comment offered on their potential supernatural implications. Yet the story of Gideon Caldwell and Arabella Moreau continues to resonate in Natchez, particularly around Halloween. Local tour guides share sanitized versions of the tale, focusing on the mysterious disappearance while omitting the more disturbing details found in private records. The building that was once Caldwell House, now operating as a boutique hotel, includes a carefully worded plaque acknowledging its connection to one of Natchez's most enduring historical mysteries. What few visitors realize is that the third-floor room where the fateful ritual took place remains the only guest room that is never booked on Halloween night. Hotel staff explain this as a quirk of their reservation system or claim the room is reserved for special events, but internal policy, passed down through successive owners, strictly prohibits anyone from occupying that space as October 31st becomes November 1st. Similarly unremarked upon is the fact that all mirrors are removed from that room on Halloween afternoon and replaced the following morning, a practice instituted in 1968 after a guest reported waking shortly after midnight to find 2 figures standing at the foot of the bed, their faces normal except for eyes that appeared to be windows into endless night. When the guest screamed, the figures reportedly turned toward the room's large dresser mirror and walked into it, vanishing from sight. Perhaps the most compelling evidence that the Caldwell-Moreau case represents something beyond conventional explanation comes from the journals of Dr. Marcus Reynolds, a psychiatrist who served at the Mississippi State Hospital in the mid-20th century. Among his patients in 1957 was an elderly man who had been found wandering near the Natchez Trace, disoriented and claiming to be Gideon Caldwell. The man, who was physically in his 70s, possessed knowledge of Caldwell's life and business dealings that would have been difficult to research given the limited public access to such records at that time. More striking still was his detailed description of the ritual performed on Halloween night, 1849, details that matched those in the private documents discovered decades later, but which were not public knowledge when the man was under Dr. Reynolds' care. What led to the man's institutionalization, however, was not his claim to be Gideon Caldwell, but his insistence that he was simultaneously not Gideon Caldwell, that he was something that wears Gideon like a garment, and that the real Gideon remains beyond the glass, hollowed and filled with stars. When presented with a mirror, the man would become extremely agitated, alternating between fascination and terror. Dr. Reynolds, a methodical clinician committed to rational explanation, initially diagnosed the man as suffering from a delusional disorder, perhaps triggered by extensive research into the historical case combined with some form of amnesia regarding his own identity. Yet as treatment progressed, his notes reflect growing uncertainty about this assessment. Patient demonstrates no other signs of psychosis or cognitive impairment, Reynolds wrote in December 1957. His account remains consistent in every detail across multiple interviews, without the elaboration or contradiction typically observed in delusional systems. More disturbing is the physical evidence. Despite his apparent age, he shows no signs of arthritis, cardiovascular disease, or other conditions common to men in their 70s. Blood work reveals anomalies I cannot explain, including several markers that, according to the laboratory, suggest his cellular structures are somehow incomplete at a molecular level. The final entry in Reynolds' case notes, dated February 3, 1958, simply states, "Patient missing from locked ward as of 4 a.m. No signs of forced entry to room or ward doors. Security reports no alarms triggered, no unauthorized persons on premises." The only unusual circumstance: the mirror in patient's room was found shattered, with fragments scattered in a pattern suggesting explosion outward from the center. No trace of the man was ever found, and the case was officially classified as an escape, though how a patient could have exited a secure facility without being observed remains unexplained. Dr. Reynolds himself requested a transfer shortly thereafter and reportedly refused to discuss the case for the remainder of his career. In 2008, during renovations to the hotel's 3rd floor, workers discovered a small space within the wall of the infamous room, a space that architectural plans suggested should not have existed. Within this hidden compartment was a dusty envelope containing a daguerreotype photograph dated 1849. The image showed Gideon Caldwell and a young woman, presumed to be Arabella Moreau, seated side by side, their expressions solemn. What drew immediate attention from the historians called to authenticate the find was not the subjects themselves, but a peculiarity in the photographic process. Where their eyes should have been, the daguerreotype showed only dark voids, as if that portion of the silver plate had never been exposed to light. Experts in early photography examined the image and confirmed that this effect was not the result of damage or deterioration, but appeared to be an original feature of the photograph, a technical impossibility given the processes available in 1849. On the back of the photograph, written in faded ink, was a message: "What peers through the glass is neither us nor them, but the space between, hungry for what it has lost." On Samhain night, Trust not what wears familiar faces, but lacks the light of the soul in its eyes. The photograph was donated to the Adams County Historical Society, where it remains in archival storage. Digital copies were made for research purposes, but curiously, despite multiple attempts with different equipment, the eye anomalies became even more pronounced in digital reproduction, appearing as perfect rectangles of absolute black that image processing software registered as actual voids in the data rather than merely dark pixels. Each Halloween, a small group of individuals with knowledge of the complete case gathers privately to ensure that certain precautions are maintained. The third-floor room remains unoccupied, all mirrors are covered or removed from the building, and a vigil is kept from sunset on October 31st until dawn on November 1st. This group, which includes descendants of Isaiah Johnson and Eleanor Wilkes, as well as selected historians and caretakers of the historical properties involved, maintains no formal organization and keeps no written records of their activities. Their vigilance stems not merely from superstition, but from an incident in 1999 when renovation work scheduled over Halloween weekend was allowed to proceed despite the traditional precautions being overlooked. According to accounts shared privately among the group, 3 workers in the third-floor room reported seeing a tall male figure and smaller female figure emerge from a dust sheet covering a large mirror that had not been removed. The figures, described as normal in appearance, except for eyes like holes in reality, approached the workers while speaking words in an unknown language. 2 of the workers fled immediately. The third, momentarily paralyzed by fear, reported that as the figures came within arm's reach, he observed that they appeared to be hollow inside, as if their skin were merely a shell filled with darkness and distant stars. When they reached toward him, he broke from his paralysis and escaped, but not before hearing words that he interpreted as an invitation to join us beyond. All renovation work was halted immediately, and the traditional Halloween precautions have been observed with renewed diligence ever since. While official records attribute the construction delay to structural concerns requiring additional assessment, those involved understand the true reason: that whatever doorway Gideon and Arabella opened in 1849 remains accessible, at least on Halloween night, to entities that wear their appearances but are fundamentally other. Psychologists and skeptics might dismiss these accounts as the product of suggestion, the power of a compelling narrative to shape perception, or even mass hysteria in a community steeped in supernatural tradition. Yet, the physical evidence, the mirror fragments with their inexplicable properties, the daguerreotype with its impossible features, the chest of ritual materials with their warnings about hollow ones, suggest something beyond conventional explanation. For the citizens of modern Natchez, the Caldwell-Moreau case has become part of the tapestry of local lore that makes their city a destination for those interested in history and the supernatural. Few realize the full extent of the evidence suggesting that on Halloween night, 1849, 2 people found a way to pass physically beyond the boundaries of our world, or that something wearing their faces occasionally attempts to return. Visitors to Natchez during Halloween season often report unusual experiences: brief glimpses of a tall man and a dark-haired woman walking toward the river at dusk, the sudden sensation of being watched when passing certain mirrors, dreams of falling through darkness toward distant, unfamiliar stars. Most dismiss these as the power of suggestion or the natural effects of visiting a city rich in ghost stories and Gothic atmosphere. For those who know the complete history, however, Halloween in Natchez brings a deeper unease. They understand what Arabella wrote in her final warning: "The crossing leaves us hollow. What fills the void is neither human nor divine." They recognize that beneath the carefully maintained facade of historical preservation and tourism beats the heart of a mystery that remains, after more than 170 years, not merely unsolved but perhaps unsolvable by any framework we possess for understanding reality. And so, as October wanes each year, certain mirrors throughout Natchez are quietly covered or removed. The third-floor room of what was once Caldwell House stands empty on Halloween night, and those with knowledge of the case find themselves watching reflective surfaces with particular care as darkness falls, alert for any sign of two figures approaching from a distance, figures with familiar faces, but eyes that are windows into endless night. For the boundary between worlds, once breached, can never be fully repaired. And what passes through is forever changed, hollowed out and filled with something that hungers always for what it has lost. Something that returns year after year, seeking new vessels to empty and fill, new souls to draw beyond the glass into that realm of darkness and distant stars where Gideon Caldwell and Arabella Moreau still walk, hand in hand, neither fully alive nor truly dead, but transformed beyond human understanding into something that exists in the spaces between worlds. As you read these words, perhaps in the gathering darkness of an October evening, you might feel a sudden chill, an inexplicable sense of being observed. Should you glance toward the nearest mirror and just for an instant glimpse two figures in antique dress regarding you with eyes like windows into void, remember the warning left in fading ink on the back of an impossible photograph. Trust not what wears familiar faces, but lacks the light of the soul in its eyes. For some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. And Halloween night in Natchez remains a time when the veil grows thin, and those who crossed over in 1849 still seek the way back. Or perhaps, more terribly, seek to draw others across to join them in that realm beyond the glass, beyond the stars, beyond the light of human understanding.